Hello and welcome to a further interview with the CEO of a not-for-profit, where I invite them to reflect on their lived experience of providing leadership to their organization over the last 7 months during the COVID-19 pandemic. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by John Church, who's the CEO of the ISPCC. Hello and welcome, John.
Hi, Kieran. Thank you for having me. Real pleasure.
You're very welcome. So, John, perhaps we could begin by you introducing yourself. So tell us a little bit about who you are.
Sure. John Church. I'm just over 2 years now as Chief Executive with the ISPCC. So I'm 15 years in the not-for-profit sector. This is my third not-for-profit. And before that, I worked in the private sector, all in marketing and commercial roles, starting off in financial services a long time ago. Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose, as the French say. It's looking at exactly the same issues in financial services. And then I moved on to consumer goods and worked for the Coca-Cola company for 5 years, and then in food and drink distribution marketing. So a nice varied past before I joined the not-for-profit sector.
Great. So lovely mixture of experiences there. So if we talk then about your experience in the last 7 or 8 months, so give us a sense of what it's been like for you in your leadership, in your CEO role over the last, well, it's 8 months now, actually, since March of this year.
Yeah, it's coming on 8 months, and where I'm sitting here today in November, it's probably going to go on for some time. So it's not just a flash in the pan, once-off event that really does test one's leadership. I think it's been a fantastic experience from a personal growth perspective, but also the organization had been going through significant change. We'd pretty much pre-COVID, we'd pretty much agreed our new strategy for Childline particularly, and for the ISPCC as an organization. We had agreed a budget. So we'd set out the roadmap for what we knew exactly what was going to happen, and that was hopefully a successful year and a rollout of a new strategy. And then COVID hit in March. So yeah, it's been a real test, and certainly from a personal perspective, it has been a test. And I remember week 1 vividly, Kieran, because we made a call very early on during this, from looking at what was happening overseas, but also what was happening in the UK. And it seems like a distant past and distant memory now, but if you remember, the Cheltenham races, the famous Cheltenham races had happened, and the ensuing negative publicity around that was floating around. And then St. Patrick's Day was on the horizon, and you just can't give up St. Patrick's Day at all when you're Irish. You have to have St. Patrick's Day. But I thought at that time, there's no way that the government are going to let St. Patrick's Day go. It just can't happen. And so as an organization, we called it very early and decided to close the offices before the government had made the announcements. And I think in hindsight, that was a very good decision, because we had put a lot of preparation in place. We were going through quite a lot of digital transformation anyway as a team. So what I mean by that is we had moved all our servers from big boxes in Baggot Street to the cloud. We had set up Microsoft Teams as our preferred communication and video. And to be quite frank with you, nobody knew how to use it. But suddenly, week 1, we were thrown in at the deep end, all of us. And despite the fact that our IT department said we're not ready for it, we were ready for it. It was sitting there. We weren't ready to use it in its perfect format, but you know what? We were all set up to do it. And I remember, from a personal perspective, that week feeling completely out of control on day 1, because we'd set up, as most CEOs would do in any industry, you'd set up your dashboard, your regular meetings, you'd have your key people around you at regular times, and you could keep a very close eye on the business. I remember being stuck at home on a video system I didn't quite know how to use properly. We weren't allowed to share documents because we weren't using a format that allowed for that sort of confidentiality. and didn't know where my team were. Well, I did, of course, but they're not in front of me. I don't know where they are, and I'm out of control. But certainly, within probably 48 hours, we had cracked it all, and we had set up meetings every 2 days with my senior leadership team, and then the fundraising team, which is really important as well, and all the others, finance, comms. So by the end of the week, ironically, I was feeling more in control of the business and more hands-on with the workings of the operation than I had in the previous 12 months, to be perfectly honest.
So a very kind of dramatic week of adjustment there. And you were saying there that as you reflect back on it, that it's been I think you said it was a fabulous opportunity from a personal development perspective. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think, certainly when I took up this job 2 years ago, for me personally, and I know from talking to others, you kind of set personal goals for yourself when you start any job. And, I certainly reflected on what sort of CEO or manager or leader I was in my previous years. And taking some of the learnings from those years, I says, right, I want to be different. I want to do this differently, as in I want to be a better leader. I want to be probably a different style of a leader. Which is always a great question at an interview stage. What's your leadership style? And then you roll out the copybook text stuff. But I decided to do things slightly differently, and to try different things, which didn't immediately come easily to me. It was slightly outside my comfort zone, but I decided to employ a coach as well, an external coach. And you can't always share things. You can't share everything with your immediate senior leadership team. And I kind of phrase it as the loneliness of the long distance CEO is what I call it.
Yeah.
And it was fantastic to have that coach and to set some personal style. And I would have taken on a lot of reading at that style and just looking at how other organizations, how other people were managing their own team. And I suppose the biggest change for me was a realization that I'm not the person who's capable of doing all the jobs that need to be done in the organization. So, sitting now in November 2020, I'm glad to say that I have a full senior leadership team that are hired over those 2 weeks. Some were there previously, and the rest are new members of the team. And they're definitely the best team I've ever had in any organization, for profit or not for profit. And I suppose the biggest learning for me is that individually, I've now realized I cannot do their job, and I'm not expected or required to be better than them at their job. I certainly couldn't do my finance director's job. I couldn't do my head of people's job. I couldn't do my comms or my fundraising manager's job as well as they're doing that. So that was a big.
And was that a contrast between, so if I'd have met you 2 years ago, what kind of expectations would you have had of yourself in relation to that? So I'm trying to get a sense of how you've changed from, so what, if that's where you are now, a realization that you can't do, and you don't want to do their job, and they do really well. What was your expectation before?
2 years ago, I would have put myself under so much pressure to come up with the answers to all the questions.
All right.
Personally.
Okay.
So I'm expected, because I'm there, and maybe it's part of my upbringing or growing or sport or whatever, that, the questions put to you, you're expected to know the answer, when in fact you're not. Okay. You're not expected to know the answer. And COVID really rammed that home for me, because I knew I needed to rely on my team and their expertise an awful lot more than I have relied on any team ever before. And the other bit would be wider consultation and more inclusive approach to leadership. That's not to say I've never consulted before, but because you can't get to where you are now without ever consulting. But to be perfectly honest with you, a realization that including the team in some major decision making and looking for their input and decisions. I mean, one very good example would be, I was really struggling with how to approach a what I saw as being a potentially difficult conversation with an employee, I just decided to bring it to the team and share it with them. And one of my team members came up with a fantastic approach, a really inclusive approach, a very compassionate way of approaching an issue. And I remember just saying, geez, I'd never have thought of that.
Yeah.
I'd never have thought of that. And it's so obvious when you think about it to include members of your team or talk. I mean, here we are in an organization that listens to about 800 to 1,000 children a day, and I'm not listening.
Oh,
So
yeah.
now I think COVID probably made me a bit more humble, a bit more compassionate with myself and the team, for sure.
And how did that come about? So what were the things that were happening that the idea that you're more humble, more compassionate with yourself as a result of the experience? What was going on for you?
Well, I think that the humility side is realizing that my team are a very, very good team, and by placing more trust in them and relying on them more for the answers, and me playing more of a sort of a coaching role in my leadership actually was working far better than me feeling I need to have the answer here. And yes, I'll consult some of the team, but at the end of the day, it's my responsibility, my answer. I think the other side was, on the compassionate side, was realizing that suddenly we were in a completely different way of working. And you're going from one style of working where it's you've suddenly got everybody around the table. You can observe and make decisions on even body language and the way people are, the nuances of body language you can't quite get within a Microsoft Teams call.
Yeah.
The other thing was just the level of it was a different type of tiredness. I only realized, and the team realized, how much you actually do walk about when you're in the office. I love to get up and walk about, and if I've an hour or even a half an hour between the meetings, I just love to go into somebody's office, knock on the door, and say, "How are things? Everything okay? Do you need some help?" That wasn't there as well. So by the end of each week, I was certainly feeling physically and mentally more tired. And I mean, another example of the whole being more compassionate side was, I remember at the end of a week on a Friday, thanking God it was Friday, and looking forward to a glass or two of wine and some sport at the weekend on Sky. Just saying, guys, I don't know about you, but I'm absolutely knackered this week. It's been exhausting, and I could feel the entire mood of the team just go, "Wow, I'm glad you said that, John, because I'm feeling exactly the same." And suddenly, instead of having a business meeting, we just had a good old water cooler type chat, grab a cup of tea and a chat. And we just realized, we haven't been doing this. We haven't actually been doing this. I've got a senior leadership team that are based in Limerick, some in Galway. But what COVID has done for me and for us as a team is that we actually meet an awful lot regularly, more regularly than we've ever done.
Okay. And has the nature of your conversations shifted as well, just in the way that you gave that example there, kind of creating a space for some emotional support and you playing a key role in opening up that space almost?
Yeah, for sure it has. For sure it has, because I've realized that, having accepted that I don't have the answers to everything at all, I'm now saying, well, what role do I play in all of this? And it's a good question, Kieran, because it was a realization that I need to be having different types of conversations with my team that I've had. So of course, there's that sort of management side of things, and we need to move on and keep an eye on our KPIs and make sure we're doing what we're employed to do. But the conversations that are far more regular now is just checking in to see how people are.
Okay.
How are they feeling? And is there anything that I can do to help them move on,
So how would you describe your leadership style? You're describing a very different type of leader today than you would have been a couple of years ago, putting yourself under a lot of pressure to have all the answers and to know everybody's job inside out and taking a lot of responsibility. So how would you describe your leadership style?
I think it's shifted to what I said earlier, which is more of a coaching style. You
And
know,
if you unpack that, what does a coaching style mean to you?
it means listening an awful lot more to the team, how they are personally at any one time. Also listening to myself and listening or feeling my own gut. I mean, we talk about, oh, I have a gut feeling for this.
Yeah.
You know what? That's something that I've learned from in the last 2 years by taking on this coach is that, and maybe, everybody feels things differently. I certainly feel, if pressure's coming on or, we talk about a gut feeling. I feel it in the chest and the stomach if things aren't going well, or it's almost my prompt to say, listen to this, what's happening. It's testing you as an individual, or it's maybe there's somebody challenging you here, and it's up to me how to respond to it. I think whereas in the past I would have probably been a little bit overreactive to stimulus,
Okay. Okay.
where I am now saying, right, I can feel this in my stomach. Is this telling me I need to have a conversation with somebody on a more personable level? And if it is, go with it and trust it. And maybe
Okay.
that's just an experience thing. Maybe it's an age, definitely is an age thing, but it's more trusting my own gut feeling. So I think that's a style of leadership that I've adapted, and it hasn't always been easy, but it's certainly with the coach, it has helped me to instead of being afraid of those feelings, instead of those that sort of adrenaline make you nervous or prevent you from dealing with something, is to actually use it more as a sign that I need to take some action here, but not in a reactive, aggressive
Yeah.
sort of way. It's
Yeah.
more address it. You need to address it. It's not personal. It's business. It has to be done. It's certainly working for me so far.
So you get a real sense there you've developed a capacity to tune into yourself, to listen to yourself, and get us and to use that gut feeling in a way to as a way of engaging with people and situations in a different way than maybe you would have done
Yeah,
before.
and
And
trust your own gut. I think trust. You're not always going to get everything right, but I mean, I'm kind of the traffic cop between my executive and the board, so I have to. It's easy, if things aren't going my team's way, that they might sort of give out about a decision that's been made on the board, but that's not for me to go and give out to the board. Or
yeah,
I'm there to look at the whole business in a non-personal way, and decisions are made for very good reasons. So rather than me reacting to things and taking things personally and getting emotional about it, it's it's actually taking a step back and listening more to people's viewpoint and perspectives.
okay, okay. So if I was having this interview with you and we didn't have COVID, so I'm curious what has been the specific contribution of your COVID experience to your leadership development? Has it accelerated it? Has it shifted the focus? Have it Yes, because what I'm interested in exploring in these interviews is how the experience of leading through COVID has influenced people's understanding of leadership and their practice of it.
Well, it has definitely made me think differently, and I think it's created a sense of urgency. That's what immediately comes to mind when you ask that question. It has created an urgency. So, we were moving towards change and towards culture change in the organization, towards change as a service provider. We had lost some relevancy with children. I mean, our audience is children and young people up to the age of 18, and you know 800 to 1,000 engagements today is a lot of talking and a lot of
Yeah,
listening to children. It's a lot of need, but we certainly felt from where we had come from, uh, we had lost some relevancy. So our strategy was to go digital, and still is. So we had planned all of this, and we had done an awful lot of research and evidence-based to move from just being childline telephone on to creating an online chat system, a text system, and now we've developed um, services around e-therapy, so video therapy, actually having almost like FaceTime calls and counseling sessions with children. So this was all in our plans and ready to go. And COVID actually kicked us into that very, very quickly. It was incredible because we could no longer have face-to-face meetings with children. So suddenly we'd moved from going into either their front sitting room, or them coming to one of our offices, to actually having a FaceTime WhatsApp call with a child. And so it kicked us into urgency, and that, I think that had an effect on me personally in terms of, wow, the decisions we were making leading up to this were actually the right decisions. Had COVID not happened, would we have maybe procrastinated a little bit on this, or maybe pushed it out to, oh, the autumn's a good time to launch, when in fact what it taught us was we're making the right decisions. We've done our evidence base, we know this will work, so just go and do it. And thankfully COVID made us go and do that very, very quickly. And we set up some pilots during the March, April, May, and by Q1 next year we're going to have the results of what's turning out to be a fantastic pilot, which will enable us to get to more children. So personally, that kind of said, as a team, we knew what we were doing. Maybe just to move ahead a little bit faster on things where you really genuinely know you're doing the right thing.
It's really interesting. So that urgency piece, because I was having a conversation with somebody else, and they were saying that typically there's a high tolerance for high failure rates in innovation projects. And they were noticing that there was a huge level of innovation going on within voluntary organizations, moving from office-based to home-based, moving lots of services online. And there was a huge level of success in the innovation. And I think what you're describing there, that urgency to get on and do it. Were there any other surprises for you within the organization that you discovered during COVID-19?
Yeah, there was quite a number of things, Kieran. I hope I can share some of them with you. All right. I mean, first and foremost, in terms of productivity, we did not lose any productivity at all. Now, did that surprise me? I have to say, yeah. I have to be honest to say, yeah, because again, in the past, I probably would have focused more on time and people being in the office, and they're putting a good day's work in.
Yeah.
When in fact, my whole thinking has changed completely on that, and totally influenced now by COVID, where we shouldn't be measuring people at all on time or in the office. We should be measuring people on their output and what they're actually producing. Now, we've all heard that before. Where have you heard that? Everybody talks about that. There's books written on it. But COVID has kind of proven to me that we have a very dedicated team that, with very, very few exceptions, turned up and did the job, and actually in some cases did it better. One example was, within listening services like Childline or any call center. We're not a call center, and I don't like using the word call center, but actually the same principles apply in terms of the ability to answer calls and answer the amount of calls that are coming in. We recorded one of the highest call answer rates ever during the COVID period, of 95%. So we were answering 95% of all calls that were being made to Childline, which is exceptionally high. If you look at our counterparts in the UK, if you talk to call centers, they would say 85% is a very good benchmark. We were up to 95% at one stage and 100% on all online chats. So that kind of, I thought that was fantastic, of course, because there were very few children left unanswered. But it also forced me to think, maybe the way we're working now, and something about the way we're working now, is actually producing a high level of productivity. And that's something we're starting to explore with the team now. Why when people are not hands-on with their individuals, that we're actually getting higher productivity on the likes of Childline? So that was a really interesting,
and a kind of surprise, or something you're discovering.
It was a lovely surprise, because it's one of our key performance indicators. We wanted to reach this 85%. Suddenly we were we were doing better than 85. From the team's perspective, I've now raised that to 90%.
And any other surprises? Because there's my sense is that there's always an unimagined possibility within situations. It's a question of whether you can spot it or not, or you're open to it. And something like COVID, which is so disruptive, we spot things that we've never spotted before and think, oh gosh, yeah, I hadn't thought that was possible, or why we can do it this way. Any other surprises or unimagined possibilities that you came across?
Unimagined possibilities, I think, and definitely one aspect of our strategy. And listen, this was helped by the fact that we got out of the blocks very quickly in March, and we had a very successful emergency fundraising appeal. And I suppose this was one aspect of our thinking at the time. I know from talking to other CEOs and even heads of fundraising, there were some charities that felt, do you know what, this is not a good time to be going out asking people for money. It's a bit insensitive to be doing that.
Yeah.
We made the decision, we took the opposite decision in Childline, and we were right in the end. And as a result of doing that, our strategy and rollout and our plans have not been derailed. If anything, we have now accelerated them. So the fact that we got out early and took some pressure off fundraising, because we were looking at between 500,000 and 600,000, immediately wiped off our community fundraising between March and June. They were the numbers we were presenting to our board. So that kind of forced us to get out very quickly. And there is merit sometimes in not depending on government funding. I know we all try to look for more, but when 80% of your funding, your income comes from fundraising and the work from the team, it does make you a little bit more agile. That's my experience in all the charities that I've been in. So it's about getting that balance. But it certainly made us more confident to push ahead with our new strategy, and within that, discover things like, do you know what, our website, what if that was a go-to digital hub for children to kind of view this as my ally, my place to go, and maybe it's forcing us or allowing us to look at a website as not being a flat two-dimensional website. I'm now not using the word website, I'm using it as a digital support hub. So children feel they can actually log on to childline.ie. They don't have to make a call to Childline, but while they're in there, rather than just reading flat text, what else can this be? So we've discovered a couple of new services and products that we hope to launch in 2021 that we would never have figured out had we not looked at the website.
Yeah, so what was it about COVID-19 that this last 7 or 8 months that has accelerated that? It's accelerated the development, but also you're more imaginative is how you're describing it. So what was it about COVID-19?
Well, first of all, hands up if we had not done as well as we had done in the emergency appeal.
Okay.
I think, like a number of charities, we would have been having different conversations. It would have put more fear and anxiety on the organization. I think once that fear and anxiety was lifted from the organization, we became more creative. And that's kind of a natural thing in some ways. I mean, I've been reading up on this whole concept of cultural entropy, which is it's an interesting piece and worth looking at, because it's about the whole endemic fear of making mistakes that are in organizations that prevent creativity. Suddenly,
give me that again. So a fear within organizations of making mistakes, and that just
making mistakes, and being cautious. So we would traditionally look at probably, the civil service as being very cautious, just do the job, don't make any mistakes, don't mess it up here. Whereas because we had done so well on the emergency appeal, we had, ensured that we met our fundraising target for the year. We'd managed to hold on to people's jobs, no salary cuts.
Okay.
People, I think, coupled with the way we were interacting with each other. So we had a number of town halls. We had a couple of just informal sessions where people were invited to grab a glass of wine and have a multiple Zoom. Like we'd 50 to 60 people on a Zoom call, just to talk about how they were and what you're doing for the weekend. So admittedly, the fact that we had such a good emergency appeal, I think, took away some of that fear and anxiety that you'd normally have, and you're getting into horrible conversations and scenarios when you've got to look at reducing costs. So it turned out to be quite a creative environment.
I mean, you mentioned they're reading a book around cultural entropy. I had to pause there to get it right. Have you read any other books or articles over the that are in the leadership arena that have been, giving you ideas?
Well, I started this journey 2 years ago, and I bought all the books that you could possibly buy, and I got a little bit.
John, when you say you started this journey, what's this journey?
Well, this new coaching style of leadership, and I have a brand new coach which during COVID we still met, but we did things differently. We did a walk and talk. So we'd be out walking in whether it's the rain or sun or whatever for 3 hours, and so yes, there were quite a number of books, and some of the books like the Harvard Business Review were very interesting, but actually I got a little bit bored with business books. I felt during COVID I need to find something to escape.
Okay.
But some of the books, so two books I did discover. One was a book called Into Thin Air, which is a fantastic book about the failed Everest climb of 1996. And I think subliminally it was talking about leadership and different styles, but it was a non-put-downable book. Haven't heard that phrase in a long time.
Yeah, what was it about the book that made it non-put-downable? Because I'm really curious, because my sense is that you might have read that book a year ago, and you might have, I can take it or leave it, or in a year's time. So I think there's something about the context in which we read a book, and it resonates. So what was it about the book that made it unput-downable?
Well, what made me buy it and pick it up in the first place is I just love those sort of challenges and adventures, and personally trying to do better all the time, and that was certainly one of them. I would never do Everest. I think it's the most craziest thing in the world, but it was interesting when things started to go wrong, how people reacted on the mountain, and how as a team how they reacted, and how they all crumbled, or some of them crumbled, and resulted in quite a lot of deaths. That was really interesting, just to see how people react to fear, anxiety, which I mentioned earlier about, as being the fear and anxiety eats up creativity. The other book is a book that because when I was buying the Everest book, it comes up, people who bought this book also bought this one. I'm a real sucker for those sort of things. So I bought a book called Island of the Lost. And it goes back to 1856 when two ships simultaneously crashed into the same island called the Auckland Islands off New Zealand. Neither of them knew that they were both on the island at the same time. One ship had a crew that really worked incredibly well as a team and were very respectful for each other. They actually liked each other, and they got to know each other really well, and they were a more effective team. The other team were a very ineffective team, and 2/3 of them end up dying, some of them from starvation and hypothermia, etc., etc. So that was a really interesting book as well. So that was two books I read. I suppose from articles, working with my coach now, there's the whole area of its cultural values, and there's an organization he is now. I haven't gone into it in too much depth, but what I've read looks very interesting, and it's called the Barrett's Center, BARRETTS, the Barrett's Center, and they talk about values. And this is a really interesting part, because it looks at your own personal values and then the values of the organization, and how you can map one on the other. So it's quite an interesting insight into how people bring their own values to an organization that ultimately create that culture within the organization.
And have you done some work on naming your own values? So if you had to name your top values, let's say your top leadership?
I'm certainly starting that. I'm starting that.
Because my sense is that sometimes people can roll off values off the top of their head, right? And it's not to say that they're insincerely held, but there's something about really pausing to reflect and say, yeah, well, what are my values? What are the things that are really important to me?
Well, I've started to do that with this Barrett Center and my own coach. Now we haven't met about it yet, so I maybe I'll come back and talk to you about that at a later stage. But what is interesting is my first stab at it. You what you do is you pick values out of hundreds of values that you think apply to you, and you pick 10 of them, and then you look at the organization, and then you try and hopefully hopefully there's some similarity. But what I did find was that, you know, maybe some of my own personal values I was surprised about and didn't expect them. I thought, well, they're not typical values you perhaps might see within, you know, a charity or a not-for-profit organization. So for me, and this was a challenge personally from coming from the private sector into the not-for-profit sector, was to soften some values and work on things like compassion and listening and understanding a little bit more. In my private sector days, you know, I was responsible for targets and teams and hiring and firing, and, you know, a little less compassionate than one might find. So it was kind of interesting, because when you try to compare the values you like to see in your organization with your own personal, you might find one or two are out of sync. But that's not a bad thing. It's good to be aware of that, but it helps you work on it.
Okay. So in 5 years' time, in 2025, when you look back on 2020, what are the things you'd like to be able to say about your leadership during this period?
I'd say and I've touched on a few of these things in our chat here, and I think I'd like to go back and say I'm glad we took some risks. I'm glad we trusted, or at least I'm glad I trusted my own gut and listened to that gut. But also I'm glad I took some of the risks of, I suppose, being exposed in front of my team where I didn't know the answer. You know, and that didn't come easy at times, where I say, listen, I don't have the answer, guys, or what do you think? That wouldn't have come as natural to me. And I think looking back, as it is now in 2025, I'm glad I took that risk.
Okay. So what you're describing in this conversation, John, is that you're on a developmental journey. And if I'd met you, worked with you, 5 years ago, I would have experienced you very differently than I'm experiencing you now. So,
yeah.
So your journey, like all our journeys, continue, and we're constantly, having new experiences and refining how we show up in the world. What's next in terms of your leadership development objectives? Because you said earlier on that you'd set yourself some leadership, what I'm describing as leadership development objectives for yourself. So what's next in if we go back to the book metaphor, so this is one chapter in the book. What does the subsequent chapters, have you a sense of what they'll consist of in terms of your leadership development journey?
Sure, isn't that the exciting thing, not knowing what's in the future? Listen, this is only the start of it. This is only the start of the journey. I talked about the whole values thing. I'm really looking forward to exploring that in more detail. And I'm looking forward to some more very uncomfortable moments and uncomfortable conversations with my coach first. And I think the big realization for me in the last 7 or 8 months was you bring your whole self to work. You can't be two different people, one person for work and one person for personal life. And I probably was like that in the past. So, there's a lot. I don't for 1 minute think by 2025 the journey for me will be complete on that front. And I just hope that I will be a bit more honest with myself, more compassionate with myself, but also trusting that gut feeling an awful lot more. So by 2025, I'd certainly hope to be able to do that in a more comfortable way than I'm doing it at the moment, I think.
Okay. Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does really. That sense of it would be, maybe there's more ease around it or something, or less conscious attention to it. Yeah, that sounds really
Yeah,
interesting.
I think it's less attention on yourself, on how, and less attention on, not everybody's looking at you for the answer. Not everybody's expecting you to. So it's probably how I interact with the team to get more out of it, or out of a team, whilst not being the center of all the solutions.
Yeah. So in preparation for this conversation, you probably had lots of different reflections. Is there anything else you want to add about your experience of leadership during the last 8 months that we haven't covered so far?
I think I've covered quite a lot.
Okay.
I hope. Let me see. No, I think certainly. Oh, actually, one thing certainly from the start of COVID, I kind of felt a sense of duty to the team and to everybody in the organization. So I was doing this pre-COVID in terms of every Friday I would send out a weekly update to the entire organization. I started this when I first joined the ISPCC. I thought it would only last a few months, and then I asked people, now that I'm here 6 months, I think I'll just move on to something. They were going, no, continue to do it. We all want to know what's happening, and we'll really look forward to your Friday emails.
Okay.
So I thought, wow, this is interesting. So, but my emails changed. The tone of them changed during COVID to be less sort of business-like to more compassionate. I hear the difficulties. We understand the difficulties that you're having working from remotely. So it was a very much looking after the team and feeling that I wanted to look after the team, particularly the younger members of staff with very young children, and they were sharing a kitchen table between, the husband or wife and the children, and trying to childmind. It was a terrible time. Thankfully, all my children are now adults, and I didn't have that. But one thing kind of struck me as I was looking out for the team was, who's looking out for me? who's keeping an eye on me? And this might be a little bit old school thinking on my part, where I need to be, best foot forward. I need to be brave in all of this. I can't show any signs of weakness. To making sure that I was actually looking after myself physically and getting out and doing some physical exercise. So I would have upped my physical exercise. I would have, very little alcohol intake, exercising every day, getting out into the open water, which I love to do in the sea along the East Coast.
Okay.
So getting back to what I mentioned earlier about the loneliness of the long distance CEO, I had to look after myself.
Yeah.
But that didn't stop me from any time with my team saying, you know what, I'm feeling exhausted today. I think I'll just take a break.
Okay.
Whereas I don't think I would have said that in the past. I don't think, I wouldn't have probably had the nerve to say that in the past. But it's how everybody else was feeling, and so that's just kind of that was hugely beneficial to me, actually, to acknowledge and just not see that as a sign of weakness, but actually reflecting probably what others were thinking at the same time.
Yeah. So that you talked about bringing your whole self, so showing up in a whole way with the team, being doing the tasks stuff, but doing the caring stuff, and then acknowledging what impact it was having on you, and opening up and taking the risk of sharing that with them.
Absolutely.
John, thank you very much. I really appreciate you being so open and so honest, and giving us an insight into your journey, your leadership journey over the last 8 months. I wish you every success as the new chapters, or the subsequent chapters, the next chapters begin to write themselves.
Yeah, blank pages at the moment, but I hope to share them later. And thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome, John. Thank you very much for this.
Thank you, Kieran.